Unlike many civil servants, I came into the civil service midway through my career and tended to focus on education and related issues, but still moved about a bit. Others come in and do lots and lots of different things. The front here is in the fast food is doing a different job every 6 months. So it very much depends where you come from into the civil service, what your experience is. I'm going to try and talk about broad issues in this half hour, not much about my personal experience. Well, let's start with ministers, because we only exist because we have a government of ministers. And I suppose the first thing that struck me beginning to work with ministers is how incredibly busy they are, because they have 4 really quite different jobs to do. The first is that in Scotland they must be an MSP, and in England, the rest of the UK, they're usually an MP. And that's a full-time job, representing the constituents and working within Parliament. They're almost certainly a very senior figure in their political party, so they'll be involved in leading that political movement in the country. And these are the 2 roles which are not particularly relevant to civil servants, but the second 2 are. There's a lot of formal business in government, and we'll talk about some more of that later. Bringing forward legislation, formally spending money, appointing people representing the country, cutting ribbons, and so on. And ministers do lots and lots of that. And as well as that, they need to develop and implement policy based on a combination of what they said in the manifestos and what they discover when they come into government that they have to deal with. So intense pressure on ministers. I guess most of what follows is about what are the consequences then for civil servants. And there's a caricature of the civil service reaction, which is to stop the minister, to manage them, to be very manipulative. And many ministers, when they come in, and look at some, well, they are ministers, would say that there's an element of stupidity. Most civil servants, having seen that programme, would recognise many of the behaviours, maybe slightly exaggerated, maybe slightly. But that's not going back in time, the Chinese civil service, the original mandarins, went through an intense process of being selected according to ability. And that principle carries forward in the UK civil service, in Scotland, and in many other countries. There are some posts where people are just appointed on a political basis, and it varies across countries. Very, very few in the United Kingdom political appointments. Almost everybody is appointed on merit. The description of the process that the Chinese mandarins went through, being locked in a room for 4 days to write an essay on the 8 themes, and if they died, their body was just thrown over the wall beside the place they were doing it, is slightly worse than what we had to go through. 4 civil service values which underpin how we do our work, and a lot of today is about thinking about the how as much as the what. In a sense, these words are obvious, but they give you a fairly quick framework you can use to test. Should I do something, or should I not do something? So impartiality is acting solely according to the merits of the case and serving equally well governments of different political persuasions. I work for Conservative, Lib Dem, Labour and SNP ministers, as have many of the other civil servants in the group. And you must act in a way, and this is the test that I would apply, in a way which deserves and retains the confidence of ministers, while at the same time ensuring you can establish the same relationship with ministers in a future government. Integrity is putting the obligations of public service above your own personal interests. And 2 bits of the definition here. First is you must deal with the public and their affairs fairly, efficiently, promptly, effectively, and sensitively to the best of your ability. Very much about how you do your work, and you can trust the quality of that work. And another bit of the definition, which is interesting when we come on to honesty. You must not disclose official information without authority. So there is a corpus of information which exists, which you must not disclose unless you are authorized to do so. Objectivity is basing your advice and decisions on rigorous analysis of the evidence. Well, of course, it would be limited. But then you have a manifesto, which is based on a set of political beliefs and commitments. So you've got to find a way of contributing to that through the ministers have to go through. And part of the definition of that one is you must not ignore inconvenient facts or relevant considerations when providing advice or making decisions. Yes, Minister, you don't want to know that fact, but it is a fact. You need to think about it. And then honesty is about being truthful and open. So you need to be open, but remember you're not allowed to disclose official information without authority. And therein lies one of the tensions, in fact. You must set out the facts and relevant issues truthfully and correct any errors as soon as possible. If a minister says something which you discover is an error, particularly if it's in Parliament, all hell breaks loose until you have ensured that not a bit of people have been through that process, until you can ensure that Parliament has had that error corrected and a proper apology given. So these provide you with a framework and sometimes the basis for interesting discussions to try and work out what we should do. What are the jobs that civil servants do? This is an advert from Canada, but it's quite typical. You can see from the picture there that it's implying that the people who are civil servants in Canada who are not going to become rich, as they probably don't do in very many countries, are frontline service providers. Emergency services, health, and luxury others who are meant to be. And so in different countries, some people are called civil servants, who in this country we wouldn't think of as civil servants. We're probably in about the middle when we come to look at what we do in Scotland. And I was browsing the internet for these pictures and I found that one. In South Korea, it's actually a television programme which is a little bit like the story behind Mr. and Mrs. Smith, two different civil servants who are secret agents. They don't know what to end up, they shoot each other. Okay? TV series. So maybe secret agents are civil servants in some countries. So what do we do in Scotland? I think there are four broad and overlapping types of work. The first is supporting ministers in their official role, ensuring they turn up at the right place to cut the right ribbon, ensuring that they actually give the answer on the right day for the question, the answer to the FOI request, the legislation goes to Parliament in the right format, can't be legally challenged because it's properly got through and so on. We support the democratic process, and I'll say a bit more about that later in the context of what happens around about an election. Civil servants are one of the groups of people who ensure that democracy works and that people have got access to the kind of democratic systems and processes that they can trust. And that leads on a little bit into ensuring high quality government processes. Remember the one about integrity was about the quality of what you do. So if you write to the government, you should get an answer which A answers the question, and B is correct, and C is sent to you on time, for example. If you do work for the government, you should get your money within, in Scotland, 10 days of submitting an invoice. That we'll come on to later as part of trying to lead the private sector to paying invoices on time as well. And the fourth one, looking back to that Canadian picture, a certain amount of the work we do is at the front line, delivering services and improving outcomes. So here are some relevant pictures: castles, prisons, bridges, and pensions. In Scotland, the civil servants who are in historic Scotland looking after the castles and other monuments, they are actually civil servants, but there are stonemasons, there are building engineers, there are all sorts of technical people as civil servants working in that organisation. Similarly, the prisons and court service staff are civil servants. Strictly speaking, some of the court staff aren't technically, but in practice, we more or less are. Pensions to NHS staff and teachers are paid by civil servants based on their insurance. Transport Scotland, civil servants manage the process of all the roads and bridges, and so on. Schools are inspected and care homes inspected by people who are civil servants, and a number of us in this room have been involved in the process working with technical specialists of disqualifying unsuitable people from working with children and or vulnerable adults. A legal process which civil servants are formally part of. But the bulk of what we do and what you probably think about is the second chunk of activities around policy, democracy and money. Providing staff ministers on policy, in a sense, it is the core of what civil servants do at the heart of government. The minister comes in, ministers come in with a set of things they want to achieve, and a set of circumstances which they inherit, and a set of things that develop as they go through their administration. And they will need to decide what to do about these various things, to achieve what they want to achieve and to cope with what life has thrown at them. And what they do is, in broad terms, policy on a whole range of different things. So the minister wants to achieve X, a reduction in obesity, a reduction in smoking, better transport links between Edinburgh and Glasgow, whatever it is. And the question is how? Because in the election, in some cases they will have said very precisely what they will do, exactly how many police officers there will be, what the size of classes will be, and so on, what the length of waiting times will be. And that's often a nightmare, because sometimes to achieve that is very, very difficult to discover that when they're faced with reality. But they have to make promises to get elected. Trust us, they'll make the country a nicer place. It's going to get elected, so you've got to make some specific commitments. But in other terms, the commitments are quite broad. They're about broad achievements, improvements in health, education, and so on. So the civil servant's job is working with others to pull together all of the evidence, all of the ideas, all of the issues, and various possible ways of doing this, negotiating with the minister, with other ministers, and at the end of the day there will be a paper going to the minister or to cabinet that provides advice on what policy, what next should be. And that process is likely to continue with lots of iterations as that advice is then turned into action, and some of the action works and some of it doesn't work because all sorts of things happen, and so you have to keep developing that process. It isn't just develop policy and then that's it. It's a continuous process. Connected to that, but not just to do with policy, civil servants help ministers make decisions. As citizens, we want to know that decisions are properly made, based on the evidence, but also that the process of making that decision is formally recorded. This document said to the Minister for Education, it's recommended that you make a decision about X, and the options are A, B, or C, which would you like to do? And the Minister says, I want to do D, and so you then have another paper to confirm that it was D that he wants to do. That's then established as the decision-making process. Civil servants need to make sure that ministers are seen to make decisions for internal and external purposes on the basis of clear agreements and discussions recorded at the cabinet. There is a view that the very small government that some people would like makes policy on the smallest number of things possible, sends the policy out in written documents, and then forgets about it, and lets other people worry about how to implement it. And that is an intellectually incredible approach. The civil servants are not experts in delivery, other people are. So you construct the right policy, and then you let them get on with it. There's an alternative view that in order to construct good policy, you need to interact with the people who are responsible for delivery. So in most parts of Scottish public life, policy is developed collaboratively with the ministers, civil servants, and the wider community in Scotland doing that policy as well, be it education or police as well. And then ministers and civil servants are much more closely engaged in many of the processes associated with implementing. Partly to make sure it does get implemented. Because as we'll see later on, people may not like the policy, and if there isn't somebody checking that they're implementing it, they may not, or they may subvert it. So you need to be very close to it to ensure that it is being implemented. But equally, the policy might be bonkers. And when you try to implement it, you discover that, and you have an oops moment, and you've got to go back to the minister and say, well, it's not working because this is far too difficult, far too complicated, and by the way, it conflicts with what you said last week about this other thing. So we need to you can revise that. If you're not at the front line, you don't know the real story of what's going on. Ensuring democratic process operates effectively, and I've got an example later about what happened with election times. But at all different points in the process, there are bits of democracy which are happening. People are having a chance to speak to ministers, but not being given favouritism in terms of the access. People got equal access to ministers, whatever that means. People's questions are answered. They're answered correctly, on time, and so on. Elections are held effectively. That's largely the business of local government, chief executives, rather than civil servants, but there is a relationship. Supporting ministers in the discharge of their formal duties, I mentioned the kinds of things ministers do. Some of the most important people in terms of the minister's life are the people who run their diaries to ensure that all of these things are happening at the right time. And there are a list of things that must be done on particular days, particular hours, particular minutes to get everything to work. And then the small matter of managing the Scottish budget, largely civil servants involved in the mechanics of that, and we'll talk about that later, but the total amount of money is £30 billion, so it's quite a challenging exercise. And then the last set of activities is about communication. Some of them imply by what I said earlier. So communicating with the public, you have a right to know what your government is doing, and you have a right to know why, and you have a right to know how well it's doing it, not just because of the election, but because they are your government. But you've also got a right to be heard. Your views are important, and there are 5 million different views. Well, actually, there are more than that, because individuals have got several different views depending on which hat they've got on. As a citizen, as a teacher, as a parent, you have a different view about the same thing, actually. And organisations as well. There are thousands of organisations working in Scotland. I can't remember the figure, but there are tens of thousands of voluntary organisations. And they all need to be communicated with. And there are umbrella organisations and so on. Civil servants are involved in that process to ensure that what people are doing is actively being listened to and have a chance to live. And all of that only works if there are good relationships. You've got to have a good relationship with the MSPs who might be the next minister you work with. But you've also got to have good relationships with the private sector, public sector, the voluntary sector, and indeed people in other governments. A lot of my time was spent in the last couple of years with the SNP government talking about independence, working with civil servants in the Treasury, trying to persuade them to give us more money, and they were trying to persuade us to take less money. And that's a continuous process, it's just a bit more intense just now. But the relationships with them was absolutely critical. And you've always got to remember, as a UK civil servant, tomorrow I could be doing this job anyway. And that's a really powerful factor. That you mustn't dog somebody else in it, because you shouldn't. And if you do, you can be sure that's the job you'll get. And then as an organisation, I touched on it, we'll talk about payments to suppliers. The government is an organisation, and at its core there are about 4,000 people. If we are purporting to tell the rest of the public sector how it should manage its business, we ought to manage our business very well as a government. And so a lot of emphasis has to be put on making sure that we provide an example of the kind of well-led organisation we're telling other people that they should run. And we couldn't cope with the range of business if we weren't an effective organisation. So there's a very strong pressure to do that as well. And some specific illustrations, budget process, a little bit on a broad approach to policy related to prevention. I'll say that in a minute. Talking about a single policy area, education, and then politically probably the most interesting one, what happens round about elections. Now don't worry if you can't read all these numbers, but in broad terms, that's one of the starting points that we have for setting a budget. The figures in the middle, in total, are at what's called 2012-13 prices. So they're equivalent numbers, taking account of inflation. So in 2012, there was £28 billion available to the Scottish government. on the basis of what things cost in 2012, that compares to 30 billion 2 years previously, and only 27 billion in 14-15. In other words, what you could buy with the money available to the Scottish Government was going down by several percent on average a year, and 11% of total over these 4 years. Now that's a fact. These numbers were determined by George Osborne. There is nothing that you could do about it in Scotland. You could complain, but you couldn't actually change the numbers, apart from very slightly in the margins for some solution. And the other thing that was a given in terms of the budget process is that ministers had a discussion early in the process and decided that for the budget, this is for 13-14, so the year we're in just now, there were 4 things they wanted to achieve with that money. They wanted to accelerate economic recovery, they wanted a shift to prevention, they wanted to reform public services, and they wanted a social wage for the people of Scotland. We had that discussion without really thinking through the detail of what that meant. And by the way, there were lots of commitments which you couldn't get out of, which were also there, that had been established previously. But these were the policy things that were important for that budget. And I don't really want to talk through the detail of individual money areas, but what civil servants then did was to work with ministers, and in setting the budget, ministers and civil servants worked very, very closely together. Those of us in finance would see John Spinney at least every week, and at some points, probably every day, for quite an intensive discussion, because he was negotiating with ministers, and we were negotiating with civil servants, and with people outside government, about what kind of package you could pull together. Remembering that all of this would have to be something that was then presented to Parliament in September, several months after these negotiations, as something that was genuinely new to the other MSPs. So you couldn't have a public negotiation about the money, but you had to have a semi-public discussion with people about the issues and the challenges they were facing to make sense of what they needed to deliver what ministers and they needed. So internal negotiation with some external elements. That then led to a draft published in September, in this case 2012, where the numbers added up. I had this spreadsheet, and the answer had to be 0. And it started, it was nothing. And there were lots and lots of pressures, things people wanted to do, things people weren't sure about. We would like to do X, we're committed to doing X, and we don't really know yet what it's going to cost. Well, you better find out, and soon, because we need to plug that number in. We can't make a commitment. In times gone by, with hundreds of millions of pounds extra every year coming up, you could say it'll be all right, we'll find it. You couldn't do that in the current times. So publication of a draft, that then was sent to Parliament. Parliament then went through a process of the Finance Committee and every individual subject committee interrogating the ministers and the people who would be involved in spending that money and the people who would receive the services. And then all of that went through a process which led to some changes to the numbers. But of course it still had to balance. The answer still had to be 0. And by the way, the total had changed by that time, because Treasury had given us a little bit of extra money for political reasons, and something else in terms of the assessment of what we take from the non-domestic rates had changed as well. So there's a moving picture of what the total must be, but it's got to end up with the answer being 0. That goes through Parliament. There's then an Act which formally allocates that money. The question, which was interesting if we had a minority government, what would happen if Parliament rejected the budget? The answer, nobody was very sure. But what we thought would happen would be last year's budget would just go forward. At a time when there is more money than there was last year, not a problem. At a time when there's less money than there was last year, which is where we are now, that would be a problem. But thankfully we never got to that stage, so we don't know what would happen if Parliament could present. Money is then allocated out. Grant letters to college organisations, allocations to authorities, health boards, and so on. And then the rest of the year, this is money, that negotiation needs the publication in September. This is about money given out from the next interim, and so on. in the next 12 months, then manage to spend, and of course things will change. Extra money will suddenly appear from London. Always does. And some other money will mysteriously vanish from London or from somewhere else. Something will suddenly appear which costs a lot of money that we couldn't predict. We'll discover that something we were afraid might happen in the building of the Forth Bridge hasn't happened, so there's some extra money. There's bad weather in the Western Isles, so we can't build the school we wanted to build. So right through to the very end of the year. And of course, on the last day of the year, Brussels tells us what the penalty is which they're going to apply because of their assessment of how well we have managed European funds. So on the last day, you've got an uncertainty of about 30 to 50 million in the budget. But you've got to come in within about 3 or 4 out of 30 billion. So you can imagine the almost by the hour adjustments to budgets as you go through that last month. And throughout that time, there's reporting and scrutiny, internal reporting and external reporting and scrutiny by Parliament, by auditors. So a complex process, which always has to end up with the IPC. Completely different, prevention. This is one of these things where it's obviously a good thing, isn't it? You do something today to stop bad things happening tomorrow. Why wouldn't you? Well, there are lots of reasons, we'll come to them in a minute. But kind of examples, and you can go right back in time. So the building of sewers in the 19th century was a prevention in relation to mental health. Parenting programs, crash barriers on the roads, infection control, blue light discos, which are discos that the police or fire service run on Friday night to get young people off the streets, so they're less likely to be out there doing things which involve and have to be picked up by an ambulance. And a whole range of public health problems. And there are lots of other things. And one of the things ministers said they wanted to do in this Parliament was to increase prevention, so that they could reduce the amount of money we have to spend on dealing with problems. A lot of them health related, but also safety related. So is that always a good thing? Well, first question, is that preventative measure which you are going to do for 3-year-olds, which is designed to stop them ending up in prison when they're 20, is it working? How do you know? Because they're only 3. And the test is that they're not in prison when they're 20. So you have to wait 17 years. You can't. So you need to think about what intermediate measure would you have to test whether that intervention is something that was worth investing money in, and actually more important than money, capacity. The people who are available to do the preventative work are the volunteers, the families themselves, the communities, the paid staff, but there's a limited capacity available. So what's the best way of using that? So is it improving outcomes by more than some other thing might do? That's a very hard question to answer. Is it good value for money? What's it costing? Well, come on in a minute to how do you measure things for the outcomes and not measure using the same thinking, right? You say good value for money, but you don't get money out of it at the end of the day, you get improved outcomes. Although you do in this case spend a bit less money in the future because you're not having to have as many fire engines to go put out fires, for example. Then you say, we still need as many fire engines because people need to know they're there in case there's a fire. So do you actually save money? Would it be better to intervene when something starts to go wrong? So rather than be the nanny state and prevent anybody from ever having a bad outcome, and thereby prevent them from ever learning anything, is it better to wait until you can see that something's about to go wrong and then intervene very quickly? And sometimes that is the right approach. And that leads on to the next one, does prevention actually limit individuals' freedom? And the really hard question that the finance director will ask you, can I afford prevention today because I'm still having to provide all these things because we didn't have prevention 5 years ago and stopped needing them? So how do you actually get the resources for prevention? And the answer that John Swinney had in the last budget is to have several £100 million which is allocated in the budget explicitly to prevention, which can't be used for anything else. So you force that question almost to go away. There is money for prevention, it's how you use it. Civil servants' role is to explore all of these questions with people and to agree and ensure that the right reform is implemented. But of course, we don't know for another 17 years to be discovered if the prisons are half as nice as that. Third example is about education, but I'm not really going to talk about education here. Apologies to those in the room who now know much more about this than I do. In broad terms, curriculum for excellence is about defining what learning is intended to achieve and how you go about achieving that. The civil servants' challenge is to think about how do you secure a change in the practice of other people and in the experience of other people, the learners. You could impose and say, this is what you must do and how you must do it. There are the rules, get on with it. When I was a schools inspector in the 1980s and 90s, I went into schools and said that they must increase the amount of time for education from 55 minutes a week to 60 minutes a week, because that's what the rules said. And they said, yes, okay, we'll do that. And we both knew that was ridiculous, but that was what the system expected. That's what the politicians expected, and it's what the education and political system did to itself. Because it's more comfortable to be told what to do. Consensus is uncomfortable, because you've got to get involved in making the suggestions, and actually put your money where your mouth is and say, we're going to try and achieve this is how I think we could do it, find the debate and reaching it. That agreement is messy, and it doesn't play very well in Parliament, or with some of the press, or with some parents, who would rather it was all very clear. They knew exactly what they would expect of the education system. And the education system itself has tended to do that. And then the next question is this a detailed prescription, whether it's done by consensus of position, or is it a broad outline, and you then trust people at the front line to work out the detail for themselves? In principle, curriculum for excellence is about the broad outline. And a number of people in this room know that there was a lot of pressure for a lot of the detail to be specified. And there was a continuous tension with me and others saying, we are not the experts. We might have views about how you teach science, but we are not the experts. So you should sort out the detail for yourselves. But then the risk is that the practitioners and others then agree amongst themselves on very rigid, which actually goes against the principles. So it's not as simple as to understand that. Yes, it involves stakeholders, but not just the teachers, the parents, the employers, the pupils. One of the best moments in my career was standing in rooms filling with about 3/4 teachers and 1/4 pupils. And the teachers were talking about assessment and saying how pupils didn't want this and they wanted that, blah, blah, blah. And then one of the people stood up and said, no, that's not the issue. This is the issue. It changed the debate completely. Now, the teachers weren't wrong. That people wasn't speaking for every pupil in the country. You needed that debate with both sides of the world. And as with many things, is it like the detail outline? Is it about clear principles? Yes. So you know what you can expect. Is it also about flexibility? As things develop, we will make changes because experience tells us we should. And assuming you've answered all of these questions and you're constantly being asked the challenge, then how do you make it work? And whichever of these models you've taken, even if it's a consensus and it's a broad outline and it's flexibility, you need to program it well. You need to know what it is that's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and people need to know. So you then move into, and it's going to be part of what we're hear about later this evening about systems thinking. It's about how do you manage that big complex program of activity so that everybody involved in it, A, knows what their job is, what their contribution is, B, when they've got to do particular things, and C, where the whole program is, how it fits together and how that's contributing to what they need to contribute. And again, civil service job is to be part of that process, to make sure that all of that gets debated, discussed and done, but not necessarily to do it all in detail, unless you decide that's the model you want. And the final example is about elections. And I thought I would just talk you briefly through the sequence of events. and it's one of these things that's difficult to know where to break into the sequence. But let's assume the starting point is the manifesto. So at some point before the election, manifestos are published, promises are made, political parties say, if we get in, we'll do this, and we won't talk to them, and blah, blah, blah. So you're faced with all of that, but exactly the same information that the members of the public have, but one of your jobs is to say, what would that mean? If they were there with the majority, that's the set of things they are committed to doing. What would that mean for us? How do we have to organise ourselves? What would the consequences be of doing that, as well as all the other things we might need to do? We can't require a change of resources, money be involved in that. What would the practical issues be that we might not want to have thought about yet? And what about combinations of parties, which increasingly we want to think about? So while we're doing that, and that's going on, if you like, in the background, away from ministers, because all parties are equal in that sense, because then a pre-election period, when the business of government has to continue, but as far as possible, ministers stand back, and civil servants trying to make sure they stand back from doing things which would be seen to confuse the role of being a minister with the role of being leading a political party. So that's blurred in ministers' day-to-day activity has got to be. They go and open something and they appoint somebody to a job and they'll make a statement. These things have to get separated so it's clear this is the business of government, people are still being appointed to jobs, money is still being paid, and so on. And some little bits of legislation to manage are still going through. But as far as possible, the politics is taken out of it for a few years. And indeed, at the time of the UK election, Scottish ministers and civil servants have to try and respect that. And in the Scottish election, UK ministers have to try and respect that. So it's a complex relationship. And then again, simultaneously with that, individual political parties are invited, I think this happens every election, certainly every recent election, they're invited to come to talk to the civil servants about what they would do and the practical issues. So I've had conversations with people, some who ended up being the minister for the thing area I was working in, and some who didn't, about what they would do if they were elected, and we can go through some of the practical issues with them that we would need to address with them right at the very beginning of that process, which helps them get their heads around the kind of issues they need to deal with. I'm not sure it's ever changed what somebody promised, but it does mean on day one, we're ready having had that conversation, and they're ready having had a conversation to go straight into it, but a practical discussion about what we do about it. And again, all parties know that this is open to every party. We don't all take up the offer, but many. After the election, in a few days after the election, and I've not been directly involved in this, but lots of others have been, if there isn't a clear winner, then there's a process of negotiating around coalitions. You might end up with a minority, a coalition, various different possible outcomes. Civil servants can be involved in ensuring that process happens quickly enough that Parliament then can get a government elected reasonably soon. And that leads to, perhaps, but not necessarily, civil servants and then the new set of ministers agreeing a programme for government. Some governments, particularly coalitions, where they have a very rigid agreement, there's a large number of specific things which they are committed to. The biggest number I was involved in was a document where there was just under 1,000 specific commitments. And we spent 5 years ensuring that every one of these was delivered, unless there's a reason why it didn't need to be circumstances have changed. With other governments, there's a very broad approach, half a dozen key things they want to achieve, and there isn't a programme in that sense. There's a series of individual decisions made about individual policies. But you get involved in that discussion with ministers. And then the final one is around the change from a maximum term when you have no idea when the election is. In a sense, that's liberating because you just have to see what happens. Or fixed, when you know that it will be in May 2011, the next election will be. So that programme for government is to a fixed end point, and you can plan to that, and all the ministers and opposition parties are planning to that point. So, in conclusion, for me, half a dozen broad issues. I'll talk very quickly about each of them, but I'll probably cover most of them in the last half hour or so, and then over to you. So, supporting ministers, but being impartial. I think most people find that quite straightforward. My view was always, and I suspect others as well, they were elected, I wasn't. If I really disapproved of it, I would resign. And obviously it never got to that point because I didn't. And most of them didn't either. So you go along with the fact that you might not have chosen to do that, you might not believe in it, but you go along with it because that's your job. It's to support your development of policy from the idea or the circumstances and then ensure it's implemented. And being impartial, everybody knows that you are supporting the delivery of that policy because that is your role. And they know that next week you might be doing the opposite because the minister has changed his mind on it and you have to compare it. Everybody knows that's your position. And the people who work in local government will be doing exactly the same. And you can have fascinating switches around after elections as part of change. So there's something about that which appears difficult from the outside, which is actually usually quite straightforward. But I suspect there are some people where the issue of independence actually pushes them quite close to that, because the work which civil servants are doing for ministers quite properly is around advancing their policy on independence and doing things where I suspect some people say that I need to be careful I'm not going too far into that territory and appearing to communicate a personal view about it, or being associated with something which might be a little bit inappropriate. I don't think anybody has, that's a personal view, but I think that's where it begins to get interesting. Openness. Remember back at the beginning, you're not allowed to give away any information which is, whatever it's called, official information, and there's lots of it. But I'm a member of the public, I want to know. So there's a real debate, and it's a permanent debate within government and with the Information Commission and people outside. What is it that you should have access to as a member of the public, or as an organisation, or as a journalist, and what is it appropriate for you not to? Now, you can take a very purist view that everything in government should be made public. Government handles personal information, we handle commercial information, we handle security information, we handle lots of information that you wouldn't want to be public about you. I'm probably quite nervous about being public about other people as well. So I think most people accept that there has to be a limit. The question is, where is it? And a lot of activity, particularly at senior level, is around responding to legitimate challenges, and we asked you for X and you didn't tell us. And very often the motivation not to tell is that it's inconvenient. Not the civil service motivation, but, if you like, the instinctive motivation of the politician is to be inconvenient for people to know that was the process you went through to make that decision, or that's what we've done in this particular area. Ministers, on the other hand, know that they have to be open. In their position, they were demanding it. So ministers have that conflict, and civil servants have to help them resolve that conflict to be as open as possible. And there are genuine different issues in that matter. Trust. You have to trust the civil servants you work with. You have to trust each other. But civil servants have to trust the people at the front line, the citizens. This system is based largely on consensus. Well, a lot of it is based on consensus. There's a huge amount of trust. It's one of the most important words, I think, that I've thought about over the last few years. How do you trust people? How do you gain other people's trust? How do you maintain and manage that trust? So we can work together in a trusting way without being naive about each other. Because people have agendas. Competence. Well, you wouldn't want an incompetent government. Do you want a government which is focused so tightly on competence that we don't care what it does to people? No. So again, there's a bit of a tension in there about how competent do you want to be. Yes, you want to do the job properly, but you don't want to steamroll over people because that would be a more efficient way of doing business. So there is a bit of a question about that. Probably also in mind, which some people know about, connected government. The bane of so many people's lives trying to put it at the front line is Minister X sees A, Minister Y sees D, and then Minister X sees Z. And they're going to try to make sense of it all. So, first thing is, tell the same story, or at least tell stories which are compatible. And we haven't always in government, and I think government's getting better at it, but not perfect. But linking to the next one in public value, if you think across portfolios, across policy areas, and say, if we did this, we could improve employability and public safety and family health. That would be a good thing to do, because you get three very different benefits out of it. So connected in the sense of thinking together about what's the best thing to do to try and achieve an outcome. That leads to lots of meetings much bigger than this, and lots of complicated conversations, and perhaps not enough actually being done. It's easier to be disconnected, see your goal, and to go straight forward. But you're not necessarily connected to the rest of what's going on, so it can end up being confusing and inefficient. And finally, public value. I'm not going to try and give you very much on that because it's a huge topic. But in essence, for me, the private, this is a gross simplification, private sector, most of the things that matter to the private sector can be measured using some kind of financial measurement. Stakeholder value, profits, turnover, most of the things that drive the private sector are to do with money. And they want to maintain good relations with their customers and their shareholders so that they can maximize one of these money measures. Now, it's not as simple as that, and many of them have got a commitment to improving society as well. But at the pure end, that's right. The third sector and the public sector, they have to deliver much more complex outcomes. We're trying to improve health, and we're trying to improve employment, and we're trying to improve the environment, and all the other things. And none of these are measured using simple money terms. We measure in terms of life expectancy, in terms of pollution and whatever it is. So public value, the discussion about public value is around how do you make sense of that and say what is the bottom line for the public sector? What is it that you're trying to achieve? And as a public servant, and this is where it's interesting for civil servants and other public servants, is your job only to do what the minister said, and of course it is to do that, and only to deliver democracy in this case? Is it also, as a public servant, to improve public value? And at what point, as a civil servant, do you do something because you think it will improve public value in its widest sense, even if that wasn't necessarily also the beneficial? And that can get interesting, because then there's a risk that you breach one of the principles and you could get partial. You start doing things because you believe in them, not because they're in some general sense what ministers agreed you want to do. So I hope that's helpful. I know that some of you have got questions in life, I know that also. Very happy.
So, I know I've got a few questions. Who else would like to say that?
I was wondering if these sort of plotting this around political advisor, which exists in the South, but don't hear so much here, exists in Hollywood or whatever, to your experience, where it's cloudy who's between civil service and political advisors.
Special advisors, which is what they're called here, but political advisors in the UK sense, are political appointments to civil service posts. So technically they are a civil servant for the duration of time they're appointed. Personal appointments by a minister, and they're there to provide them with political support. Now they have access to the civil service. They spend a lot of time in discussion with the civil service, but they are very clear, and we are very clear. They are there as, in a sense, almost because the minister can't be everywhere all the time. So they will have conversations about what about X, and I think I'll go and talk to Y, who's outside government, somebody we couldn't talk to. They could go and talk to somebody in the political party where we could themselves. So they make a real contribution as long as they can be clear about where that boundary is between their activity. But at the end of the day, the minister is entirely free to take advice from anyone. The minister does not have to take advice from civil service. He's got to listen to it. He doesn't have to take it in the sense of agree with it. So the minister can take advice from a special advisor and forget about civil service. And some ministers at various points have probably got more of that, and others are not less. And that depends as much on the quality of the special advisors. But a very necessary part of the process, because they can do things and go places and talk to people that civil servants can't, and they can help civil servants understand the politics without actually getting contaminated by them. So you know what's going on, you have a better sense of where this might be headed without having to go and have inappropriate conversations.
I've got a question. So you work in this position where you make concerted efforts to be impartial. What would you? How do you go about this as an individual, overcoming your own confirmation biases? Is there a particular exercise that jumps to mind,
There isn't a formal way that you're expected to do it, but you are expected to be aware of your own biases. And I suppose one of the roles of your manager and your team is to say, are you sure? You're proposing something, are you sure that it's right that third sector body should have another chance to go and speak to the minister? And what about these various different interests? So I think it's about internal challenge. Challenge yourself, but other people challenging you and saying, are you sure? Why did you do that? Sometimes that begins to expose you and feeling, well, actually, maybe I've got a tendency to say, well, this approach rather than that approach, so you can take a lesson. But you've got to be open to it.
Yeah, we've spoken much about public service before, and Blair, they spoke about starting this back, about reform public service. A lot of attempts have been made to reform civil service that have largely failed. And in terms of competence there, a few years ago, capability reviews were done in many departments, which showed very, very good performance. So if you've got comments about public service reform.
There's a lot of that question. I'll try and, I think there's two things I'd like to touch on. One is around, if you like, civil service itself within government. And I think in my time, since about 2000, right in the middle of civil service, we have got much better at being more business-like. So, in my last year, I was running an IT program, and it delivered on time and on budget and specification. I'm not saying that because it was me, I'm saying that because that's what we expected. We expected it because that's what tended to happen now within the Scottish Government, and we expected it because John or better do it or she would have to pay the cost. So a lot of learning from our mistakes, from other organisations, going through Curriculum for Excellence, for example. We had a team of people outside the programme, headed by somebody who was substantially taller than me. He used to be a Royal Marine, so he was quite an intelligent person. But with the 3 or 4 of them, we came in every couple of months and looked only at the governance of the programme. Check that everything in the programme is properly managed in terms of roles, responsibilities, and so on. That would never have happened 10 years ago. In 2000, the exam system failed because we didn't have that approach. So we're much further down that track within government. So I'm not saying we're right yet. We would never get to the right place, but we're definitely improving. It's taken more seriously than it was before. In terms of the public sector more generally, there's a lot of politics around that, and a belief that the public sector could be much more efficient. And the private sector could be much more efficient as well, in many cases. But the public sector has had to get more efficient because the money available has started to shrink. So minds have been concentrated even in organisations that previously might not have bothered about. So there's a financial imperative to reform the public sector, but it does come back to some of the things I was saying about prevention, where by education you're requiring bodies to work with each other to achieve outcomes. And the kind of reform that I think we need, and ministers have said we need, is for public bodies to get much better at working with each other and much less precious about their own individual place in the system to deliver outcomes. But there's a long way to go, and I suppose my defence would be the third sector and the private sector also go along to.
So I said you partially answered the question I was going to ask. But thank you, I really enjoyed the speech. The Christie Commission is very interesting, and I think it is influenced by the public sector. But Christie is quite clear, the public sector has to transform, it has to change. And that goes beyond Christie's talking about 30%. The money is wasted in lack of vision. And I'm interested in your focus on connectivity and outcome. It's a fairly broad question. With the luxury of hindsight and looking back over your career, what would you say was the most significant thing that the public sector has to do to transform the industry agenda? Because it's a radical agenda.
This is a personal reaction. I think public value to me is at the heart of it. But as a public servant, and I would include anybody working for the public good. So somebody who's doing some corporate social responsibility from RBS 1 day a week, somebody working in a voluntary organisation, a volunteer in the community, whoever it is. If public value is at the front of your thinking, so this is the job I'm doing, and I'm doing it as well as I possibly can, but I'm not doing that job at the expense of the rest of the system. So if everybody was thinking about, can I do this in a way that also maximises other benefits, or doesn't cause problems to other people because of the way I'm doing this, that would be the single biggest shift. It's very difficult. And it's very difficult to say to somebody who's hard-pressed to run the casualty wards or community teaching, whatever it is. You need to be thinking about things beyond your narrow area. But the best thing to do.
And that is, it's like one of the many definitions of leadership, the ability to think outside the box in a wider context. And probably leadership is really true.
But I'm thinking about leadership by everybody, not just them.
Yeah, leadership of all aspects, that ability to think wider is job in that wider connectivity of what we're doing.
We'll notice I made it with that information.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering, in terms of stability and qualification of people, the fulfilling roles within the civil service, certainly in the past there were many people who were generally qualified but didn't have expertise in the areas that seemed to end up working in. Is that being remedied, would you say?
Well, to say it's been remedied would suggest that I agree there was a major problem.
Okay.
And I think there is. I think there has been a change. There are probably more people now who are brought in as specialists, but many more civil servants now specialise and will acquire a specialism. So it used to be that somebody might go into human resources as a generalist, and they would then drift out of human resources into somewhere else a couple of years later, and they never actually became HR qualified. It's much more likely now that working in HR at all levels, you'll be doing your HR qualifications, and you'll be a member of CIPD and so on, and you're more likely to stay and become an HR specialist. Question for the individual is, does that damage my career? Is it better to be seen to have worked right across government in all sorts of different roles? And if somebody has managed to do that very successfully, then of course it's good for their career. But it's good for the public to have people with the knowledge of expertise working in these areas. So there's a challenge there to give career development, but also build that specialism. More people now are doing specialist qualifications. Lots of people have done qualifications in things like program and project management, which they can carry to almost any role. So it's not just you go into that job in this area. But there are lots of other people like lawyers and statisticians who are recruited on the basis of professional qualifications. Always have been, and I'm sure always will.
My name is David Seagrave. I come from a civil service family. My father was quite a high-ranking civil servant and also being head of the United Town Councils of 3 affluent Sussex towns. I was 4 months into the civil service, and that gave rise to unspeakable mental pain, ignominy, anguish, disownment, suicidal feelings, the lot. I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome 50 years too late. Now, one thing I've observed about my father and the civil service in general is they live according to a rule book, and that rule book is generally the Bible, and they're incapable of using any imagination, and they have total lack of ability to innovate, to do lateral thinking. My father scorned me for the crime of being seen with one black and one brown spectacle hook in his home, and for growing a beard between Marseille and Brighton, a 3 days journey, and for abilities to make things like making buttons from number plates. I'd be kicked out of his house for things like that. Now, civil servants I've suffered, often the word suffered, including those who revoked my driving licence because I owned a car as long as the bus is wide with a tiny engine capable of 40 miles an hour flat out, and the windscreen wiper failed in open and I made an illegal right turn. Now, for that I was forced to drive a full-size car 3 times as heavy and 1/3 wider, and I failed the test. And they made an issue of my Asperger's syndrome. I talked to myself like, mirror drill, bear right. I got hopelessly lost in the grounds of the Ashby Ainsley Mental Hospital. We could build a town the size of Cooper in the grounds. And my licence was revoked because I gave myself instructions and other things about Asperger's syndrome, which is not, as they insisted, something like Alzheimer's disease, but a characteristic of brainy people like Alan Turing. You know of him. My father certainly never heard of him.
Good, David. Phil, the point you make just concisely there.
Simply, can civil servants think outside the box? Are they allowed to innovate? Are they allowed to choose the tie they wear to the office? Or are they simply cogwheels?
Thank you.
I think more than previously. Able to think outside the box, able to innovate, they're expected to, in many senses expected to lead innovation. But the check on that is not the civil service as an organisation, so much as the ministers were elected, and the civil service has to stay within the broad parameters of what the public elected ministers to do. So with that proviso, the civil service increasingly is expected to innovate. Yes, you can do it in any kind of time.
So on that point of innovation, I'm going back to what you were talking about in terms of the churns and so on. Someone who spent a few years in a post and then will move on and acquire experience, and that's good for them, good for the civil service. There are others, as you say, that become more specialist. But there is an aspect that's lost there about relationships with external stakeholders. Quite often we'll get civil servants who for a couple of years holds the post, he or she develops relationships with external stakeholders, very good understanding of their world, and on that basis, develops great confidence, has a capacity to innovate, think outside the box and act outside the box. And if he or she moves on, the relationships are lost, and there's a paralysis in the system. Stakeholders find them a new person in post who doesn't do enough, doesn't have the confidence, needs to find his or her way around, and things come to a halt for a while.
Because, as almost everything else, it's a real issue. And it's about striking a balance. It's good for the civil servant to have experience in complexity. It's good for the development to have to experience working with different kinds of stakeholders. So for the organisation, yes, that a certain amount of movement is good. It's also good for the organisation if some people who have a home base that they tend to stay in, so you get a core of knowledge and external contacts and experience and so on. It's important that one person isn't the only contact between civil service and a major part of the system, but there will be somebody who's doing contact and they move in here with them. So there's a definite downside to the movement. Big upside to the movement, which is invisible to the outside, is that when you move from working in education to working in social work, it isn't a big step, but it's a huge step in some sense of society. You see the world through a completely different perspective. You have a much better understanding of the education world you left than you have maybe more cynicism about some of the motivations of that particular set of stakeholders. And you have an equal skepticism, cynicism about the question, as you can see, it could have been better in that sense here, over here as well. And it just, why not? And it's usually about people having fallen out. So there's something about bringing that different perspective to bear, and if you go work in police or justice, it's a very hard end of the system, then you can't be namby-pamby and work there. When you come back into social work or whatever else it is that you do next, then you bring that experience of a very different kind of view of the world that your stakeholders have. So it does help get a better sense of perspective. But having said that, you're absolutely right. If you're the stakeholder and you've had this person 2 years and now you're in that position, well, you leave and they say, why? We just got used to it. It doesn't work.
Is every meeting related for review and perspective?
Is every
Meeting or discussion?
No. There are points in the process. I mean, for internal purposes, you want to take notes of who's agreeing to do what and what you need in the meeting, because otherwise it's impossible to have the next meeting. And people don't know what to do when they go into the next bit of business. But there are points in the process, particularly involving ministers, where you would want an audit trail of decisions. So a paper went to Cabinet on that day, here's the paper, that was the recommendation, that was the evidence that ministers considered from reaching that, having that discussion, and that's the decision that they made. Yes, that would be recorded. So there's organisational reasons to record things and keep them for a long time. But there's, if you like, democratic reasons to keep particular points of decision making very formally recorded so they are available in all terms.
Completely, I have one issue to the issues you've raised, and I think it's a reflex discussion as well, and perhaps particularly around how civil servants struggle with innovation and struggle to reform ourselves. It's partly because the sort of skill sets you're describing that we learn in managing these issues is kind of always how to balance, how to collect everything and balance. We're always balancing. But balancing brings you into the middle, and we tend not to present our ministers with polarised views. And actually, it is sometimes in the polarised view that you find the new idea. And I think one of the issues I'd add to your list, Colin, which I think is disturbing in an interesting way, what the civil servant role is social media. Because sometimes, in fact increasingly, we will find our ministers just jump past us. They blog, or they get blogs. And the next thing is we're asked to deliver policy because Mrs. X said so. And we're going, but that's the challenge for us. And I think that actually makes us alert to where is the fresh, sharp, unmediated thing that we actually really should listen to. Sometimes.
Is it difficult to cope when, for example, the government changes or there's a coalition and maybe the aims of the new government aren't actually in line with your own views?
I think, on a personal basis, I didn't have a difficulty with not being my view or being my view. I can put that to one side. And I would have private thoughts about things, but I tried not to let them interfere as it sounds. So I didn't find that difficult. I didn't find change of government difficult in that you're psyched up for it. You know that there may well be a new government, and even if it's the same party, there are different policies. And the hardest for me has been working in coalition. Because there is a process at the beginning of coalition of two, possibly more than two in some cases, but two parties reaching an agreement. And it's an agreement based on an amalgamation of two manifestos. And they'll have late night negotiations over pizza and whatever it is that go on for several days. And they end up with a hodgepodge of things which they can agree to do. Some big ticket items have been big concessions, and some things, quite frankly, they were so tired at that stage that because nobody actually didn't like it very much, it stayed on the list. And so you end up with an agreement. Now that's an entirely understandable political process, which civil service is not part of. They have the process in place, but they're not part of the process of the agreement. So you end up then with that list of things you've got to do. And as long as it's a very clear list and they've all signed up to it, that's fine. But buried within that, and you can see it in media, from here, they understand, that people really didn't like to have to do X, but they had to agree for the sake of getting into that government. And so, subconsciously, the other party, the ministers, probably find it quite hard to be fulsome in their support for something because their core electors don't want them to be. You can see the Lib Dems going through that process, and the Tories, and Labour and Lib Dems did it to an extent with their coalitions and so on. I was working in youth justice at the time, and there was very clear, publicly different views on how you deal with disorder in communities between Labour and Lib Dem. The Justice Minister was Labour, and the Youth Minister was a Lib Dem. And my job was to look after youth justice, working to both of them. That was really difficult. It wasn't difficult in a sense, because I knew they would never agree, but trying to be loyal to both of them, internally and externally, when they were struggling to be loyal to each other. Not because of anything bad about either of them, they were both really trying hard, but they came from such different positions that hadn't really been resolved as part of that conciliation process. So that would have been obvious to anybody outside. I'm not telling any secrets, and that's for now, because they can see that was happening, and others who were involved in that. So that for me is what it got hardest.
Well, I have.
This is a comment, not really a question, because I've been a civil servant for I was 27 years, at the complete opposite end of the scale to someone like yourself. So I started out my civil service career in unemployment benefit office in Cornwall. And I think what a lot of people don't understand about civil service is that huge variety of jobs that people are involved with. Some are very lowly and very just, processy, and you're involved with processing benefits or writing out gyro checks or whatever. And you're a million miles away from ministers, and you don't really have any direct contact in, all those political issues and about delivering manifestos. You've just got a job to do, and you just get on with it. And then, having moved around the civil service as the day people do, and arriving in the Scottish Government, and it was such a shock to the system, because here am I, suddenly it's about what ministers want, to do, you've got to do, can't do that, and you just feel, this is just rubbish, why can't I just do my job? And so that's just a comment. Another comment really on the issue of public service reform, because the civil service is so huge, so wide, that the idea of reform is brilliant, and it comes up and people within it get it, but it's like turning the barge around in a canal. It's just an ask too much in some respects. And so I think that for people outside, they're saying, well, why can't we do it? It makes sense, and we all know it makes sense. And even as individual colleagues within the civil service, we know it makes sense, but we can't make it happen because it's just too big.
The challenge. I'm not. I think ministers' reaction to the person doing the frontline job will always be keep doing it and do it as well as you possibly can, and that's really important. And so they wouldn't have the same, they wouldn't feel the same distance from you that you would feel from them, because they would be at one frontline place a week, but never in yours, because there are so many different countries. So they would be quite close to that in their heads, even if you didn't necessarily feel that. And one of their skills, if they're good, is communicating that to the staff who are working services. I had a discussion with a member of staff when I ran the statistics team, who was collecting information about the number of children in each school who got free meals. And there was a problem with the system. We weren't getting information back from the authorities, and she was tearing her hair out. I don't know how we're doing this anyway. And so we had a conversation around how that information is used to allocate money to areas of deprivation based on preschool entitlement. But she'd never known that. And she probably got much more committed to her job because she understood then that frontline task was very importantly connected to the thing that you were describing at Belgium. And it benefits exactly the same. So somehow the leadership needs to help people understand that your job is genuinely contributing more than just the very narrow student. I think my wife wants to. I'll let you.
I keep these. Not as an appendage, but as a mind. Very feel that it's very few talk. And it's not a lot about trust and impartiality and picture of purchase for organization and things. And I'm just wondering what checks or what you have in place to ensure that, in fact, you have such civil service and it's not close corruption or whatever. You know, how we know that this is what's actually happening.
Two different responses to that thing. A lot of the trust and relationships and so on isn't easily measurable. We try to do surveys about organisations and individuals in terms of whether they get a good quality of engagement with us, that we feel we listen to them and so on. And every year lots and lots of people are sampled, and we take it very seriously and try and do things to improve from year to year. So in that sense, we try to do qualitative things I was talking about. But you're also asking about the potential corruption. But I suppose there are a number of different things that people might do. In any organisation, people might try to cut their expenses, where there are expenses to be taken. And the civil service is no different in that that potential exists. To claim your expenses, you need to get your expenses from countersigned, you've got to submit invoices and so on. So there are systems and processes in place, checks, audits, and so on. Every now and then you'll discover that one of your expenses claims is controlled over, check, and you say exactly what you're doing. So there are, as with any good organisation, there are ways of checking that these internal misdemeanours are spotted and prevented. I'm trying to assist them so that people wouldn't want to do it because they know they've been caught. That then leads into anti-fraud activity, which is broader than that, and there's a team which was in my last job, leading anti-fraud work across Scottish Government and public bodies, ensuring people had approaches to stop any kind of internal fraud and to protect against external fraud. So the Student Awards Agency, for example, are a prime target because students come from all over the world to study. They need really strong systems to try and ensure that they are not defrauded of money which they would give to legitimate institutions in a range of different places. And are we involved there in thinking through what kind of systems they have and learning from them. And then perhaps bridging that hard end and the softer end that we're talking about, the trust and so on. How do you know that the civil servant who really thinks that that particular approach to public health is the best one? doesn't manipulate the people who get to speak to the minister. Perhaps subconsciously as anarchism. And that probably is the most difficult one to deal with. How do all of us know, and how do we know that our teams are not doing things which are subverting the proper process of giving people access to ministers, because we think that that organisation is one that really ought to have a say. And so when you accept an invitation to go for dinner with an organisation, you need to be very careful that that couldn't lead anybody to think you would then give them preferential treatment. And not just the private sector organisations, public sector organisations and so on. But you have to go and meet them. You have to go and talk to them. You have to take hospitality, as long as it's not lavish. I was invited to go to Hampton to see football match, and I turned it down, because there was no possible reason to do that. But I would go to the same organisation and have coffee and one was part of the reason. And if it was over lunchtime between 11 and 3, I would have a standard lunch. And not think that that was putting my integrity at risk. But I might need to be willing and able to demonstrate
I'd be very interested. One of the things I enjoy about the talks that come through the Ragged Project is the opportunity to be taken into worlds that I have, frankly, just a pile of assumptions about. But I also realise that people spend their time trying to crystallise their life's experience into a very short space. Would there be a book that would spring to mind which explores some of the issues that I can go away and I can get a better understanding of the civil service and of government?
I don't know of a single book about the UK civil service that I would recommend. The one, apart from, I've quoted from the principles that are on the website, so you can look at that, which is an expanded version. So that, I think, helps people think about what these key issues are and the risks which are implied by the do's and don'ts. In terms of a book, we had all of us in the civil service at a set of seminars with somebody called Mark Moore from Harvard, who talks about public value and sets the civil service and a wider public service context. And I find him and that book very thought-provoking, because it makes you think about the kind of things we're talking about towards the end of the evening around the wider set of things you're trying to achieve in public service and what the challenges are. He's very clear that in order to get something to happen, you've got to have the resources. You've got to have a benefit which you can identify and demonstrate. But you've also got to have coalition support. And one of the biggest issues for civil service is being part of and ensuring that it exists, a coalition support. We wouldn't have got smoking back in public places if there hadn't been a large number of different organisations who all came together and said, yes, that's what we should do. And so, before, as a minister, you stand up and say, we're going to ban smoking in public places, we need to build that coalition. And Mark's still clear that that's a really important part, and part that sometimes we don't do well. And if you look back at failures, and I've been in education long enough to have identified a number of times when we didn't do things well, it was always that we hadn't established that coalition. We had got every single organisation, including every single trade union, signed up.
Interesting.
Sorry?
What was it, Mark?
Mark Moore. And it's public value. We have subtitles going on.
I actually mentioned this book. I just very recently seen the review of it. I can't remember who wrote it. It's called The Blunders of Government. And it's very recently out. And it's not so much about just civil service, it's civil service and competition. And it's more or less your virtuous government than your rules. And this is for me. I just sort of seen the review. I mean, yeah. From Essex. That's what came and possibly the crew. That's me usually writes the
So those books again were...
The Blunders of Government is the name of the
Right.
sort of
Superb. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Colin. Thanks very much for a wonderful